You're listening to the 30th broadcast of TBR Radio's the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR Contributing Editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed talks with fellow TBR Editor Dr. Raphael Johnson, to discuss Dr. Johnson's article on the 1905 Russian Bloody Sunday, which appears in the July-August issue of TBR Magazine.
Well, our guest again today is Dr. Raphael Johnson, and we'll be talking about his article, Bloody Sunday, Setting the Record Straight, Russia's Bloody Sunday and the Revolution of 1905, which, of course, was the cover article on this current July-August issue of TBR Magazine. So, Dr. Johnson, tell us about Bloody Sunday.
It's good to be back, Ed. I appreciate it. Sorry for all the technical problems. And, because we have this nasty thunderstorm going on here in Johnstown, I may lose you again. So hopefully it'll stay. The first thing I want to mention is when I wrote my first book, The Third Rome, which the Barnes Review published, I kind of accepted, with some differences, I guess, but generally accepted the idea of the Bloody Sunday from the English language sources. My Russian wasn't great at the time, but it's gotten much better. That was almost 15 years ago or so that I published that even more. But now, I don't have a single English language source in the bibliography. Because there's nothing in English about this that's worthwhile. So the first thing I have to do is retract yet another part of the Third Rome. It's getting to a point where I just want to pull that book entirely. The structure, the basic argument is sound, but there's too many problems with it. And a lot of it was because I wasn't using the Russian sources at the time. That book, more than anything else, was just an outline of what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my academic life. But as always, everything that the average educated American or Westerner believes about the world is a myth, is a story. Bloody Sunday is one of the worst ones, which is more than one Bloody Sunday. There's the one in Great Britain, and then or Northern Ireland, and then this one. And this was one of the things that set off the so-called 1905 revolution that led to the limitation of the power of Tsar Nicholas. It was based on a whole lot of myths. It was based, first of all, on the myth that the Russians lost the Russo-Japanese War, which was not the case. I have a whole separate set of articles on that, and broadcasts too. But the press was inventing these stories that the Russians were defeated and the Tsar can't be trusted, that kind of thing. The second myth is that this was a loyal demonstration heading to the palace where the Tsar was present. And none of that was true. Father Gregory Gapon was the main leader of this, and he was pretty much a double agent. He was eventually defrocked by Anthony Kropovitsky, who was his superior at the time. Again, everything on here was mythical. The story is that this was a loyal demonstration going to the Winter Palace, and for no reason, all these myths always have a for no reason part. The palace guards opened fire on them. Again, none of that is even true.
So I was under the impression, and so maybe correct my understanding of history here. I always thought that the Tsar's Winter Palace was on Baranof Island in what is now essentially Sitka, Alaska. Is that correct or not correct?
That is not correct. St. Petersburg.
Okay.
Or just outside of the city, I should say.
Okay. So because I saw this taking place in St. Petersburg, and yet you made reference to the Tsar's Winter Palace, and I thought that was in Alaska. Or, of course, that was Russian America or whatever they called it. But
the U.S. had bought the state by that time anyway. That was under Alexander II that Alaska was bought. And, of course, the Russians never even got that money.
Okay, you're totally correct. I'm looking again. We're talking about 1905, and I'm thinking of things that were taking place in the 1800s. So you call me brain dead today, or just flat call me stupid if you want to.
Well, very few people are aware of the truth about Russian history, no matter how intelligent they might be on other things. The only difference is some people are deliberately ignorant because it serves their purposes. Other people are ignorant just because it's a fairly obscure set of topics. And in your case, it's the latter. But you also asked me if there's any connection between either this, abortive revolution in 1905, 1906, and the, October Revolution later, 11 years later. And, there's a few things, one of the main things is the foreign funding. The Japanese, under Japanese military attaché in St. Petersburg was Colonel Mato Akashi. And he made contact with Lenin in July of 1904 through the terrorist, of course, Jewish terrorist, obviously, Vera Zasulich. And what Colonel Akashi said, he said, we were ready to help you financially by acquiring weapons, but most importantly, to prevent the leftist movement from cooling down and thereby introducing into Russian society an element of constant excitement and protest against the state. So he met with the Bolsheviks and various other leftist groups, and he wanted to organize and finance armed rebel groups up to 100,000 guerrillas at a time. So they received, at the time, about almost 1 million yen, which was just maybe 2 yen to the dollar back then. And Akashi was in Finland and Lithuania, and pouring money into this movement. Not to mention, of course, American banks were financing it as well. And just like today, these groups are getting financing from various domestic and foreign sources. And I don't want anyone to think that George Soros is all by himself. He's just kind of the public face, but every major bank and corporation has given money to these revolutionary movements in this country. I mean, if you want to even call them revolutionary, they're just, anti-white fanatics. Bank of America just released $1 billion to Black Lives Matter. And now the only thing I think that can happen here is some of these guys start making anti-Semitic statements, which a lot of them have. All of a sudden, the cash machine is going to show insufficient funds. But until that becomes a normal thing, they're going to have more money than we could ever dream of. If one bank gives $1 billion, then this is, this is one of the things that connects these two movements. But as far as the Japanese were concerned, and of course it was the Germans in at the end of World War I, but they sent 8,000 rifles to the Finns, 5,000 to the Georgians, which were never very, very big, 1,000 to the Social Revolutionaries, 8,000 rifles to other socialist parties, and 500 Mausers also in Finland. And so the Japanese made contact with a guy by the name of Zilukus from Lithuania, and they also built 2 clandestine factories in Finland, which produced thousands of bombs. And frankly, no Anglo-American historian has ever mentioned this. I'm not so sure they even know about it, or if they want to know about it. So, Jacob Schiff at this time, never mind what happened later, his money in 1905, 1906 amounted to $50 million, which was a gigantic sum in 1905. I'm not making it, in today's money. That was that money in more than 100 years ago. But the revolutionaries didn't even try to hide that their money came from capitalists abroad. The media stories in all European newspapers came from the leftists in Russia as if they were objective sources. Keep in mind that there was no press censorship in Russia at the time, and the press was in the same hands that they are today. To a great extent, Jewish hands. There were a few conservative papers, but they were not subsidized by the state in any way. Zilukus' first name was Connie. And I have a quote here. Boris Savinkov, the social revolutionary, wrote in his memoirs in 1917. He said, a member of the Finnish Resistance Party, Connie Zilukus, told the Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionary Party that through a donation from the American millionaires in the amount of 1 million francs came to the Russian Revolution. The Jewish Americans had the condition of this money that it go to arming a militia to be distributed among all revolutionary factions. The Central Committee accepted this amount by subtracting 100,000 francs for a combat organization. Well, it shows what kind of an authoritarian system could Russia have had at the time if they can build bomb factories in Finland, which of course was loosely a part of the empire at the time. So this is where this money was coming from. It was coming from all over the place. And of course later it came from the Germans, but from the late 19th century, well, even from the killing of Alexander II to the Bolshevik Revolution itself, they were always getting money from Jewish sources in America and foreign, whoever was at war with Russia at the time. And the other consistent source was Great Britain, who was always, remember when, the Tsar was trying to get out of the country, the British refused to let him in. The only person that was protesting his treatment was the ambassador from Germany.
Well, again, and I know we've discussed this probably over a year ago now on the radio, but the British royal family were his cousins. So again, why would they not take in a family member in need?
Well, they were all cousins. I mean, they were all related to one extent or another. I think he was even closer to the Germans than he was to the English. But don't forget, Nicholas's wife was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. So it wasn't just family. In this case, it was very close family. And they're enemies of Russia. The British have always been the main Russian enemy. The whole point of World War I was to get Germany and Russia fighting each other. That was the whole purpose. And of course, the British found the weakness, the leverage in the Balkans. And so the Austrians most certainly started this war, fully aware of German support. The British were threatened by both rapid German growth as well as rapid Russian growth. Germany and Russia had far more in common than they had in opposition. So the ultimate nightmare in London was that those two powers would become allies. That would be it for the British Empire. There's no way they couldn't take on one of them, barely, let alone both in combination. But in forcing the Germans to come to Austria's aid, because Austria had lost against the exhausted Serbs by the time, showing what a disaster that monarchy had become by World War I, and Nicholas was forced to order a limited mobilization, although Rasputin told him not to do it because he said he would never survive the war. So that was the leverage that they got to fight one another. So the whole point was to destroy both powers, leaving Britain really the only major colonial power in the world. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a very nasty, it was diabolically brilliant plan hatched from London to get their two main rivals to kill one another. And that's exactly what happened. But wanting the death of Tsar Nicholas, that had been on the agenda in London for a very long time. For the entire 19th century. Right up to now, actually, whenever these oligarchical leftists wanted to run away, they went to Britain. That's where Guzinski went when Putin first took over. So Britain has always given aid and comfort to anti-Russian fanatics from for up until this point at least 100 years, and even now today since the Soviet Union fell. Now it wasn't the case during the Soviet era. There was never any sanctions on the Soviet Union. The Americans and the Western NATO powers traded with Russia, even in high-tech equipment, even in military equipment. There was never any sanctions. Only when a nationalist and Eurasianist takes over, now all of a sudden the West has a big problem with Russia. But in the Soviet era, that was not an issue, and they traded huge amounts every year. Soviet students were being trained in American universities right up until the very end. And the CIA was lying about the Soviet economy right up to 1990. It was imploding, and the CIA was still saying it's a healthy economy. So, it's a convoluted answer, but the British were never an ally of Russia, despite that being the case on paper. So that's just how it is. And they wanted him dead, and the fact that they were family members has no relevance. This is realpolitik and nothing else.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
And so, Father Gapone, course, the church and the state were at one time very much married in Russia. And so Father Gapone, you said he would eventually be defrocked. So do you think that his, we'll call it rabble-rousing in this case, his political agitation, whatever you want to call it, do you think that this was a purely politically motivated thing for him, or do you think that he was basically attacking the church by attacking the state?
Well, by the time Nicholas took over, the church was more or less, when Peter the Great installed the college, the confessional college, which eventually became, this absolutely disastrous state church body headed by a layman, the church began to turn on the state for this reason. The religious college ended up bringing all the bishops together, the so-called, synod under the state. But that was a relatively recent development. That was, 18th century. One of the reasons that the churchmen, although Gapone's superior, Metropolitan Anthony Kropyvitsky, supported the monarchy. By the time the monarchy fell and the provisionals took over, the overwhelming majority of the bishops supported it. And they claimed that the reason was this so-called synodal system that was imposed by Peter the Great. Now Tsar Nicholas should have dismantled it. And if he did, he probably would have had the church's support, but he never had the church's support, especially from 1905 onward. Anthony Kropyvitsky being one of the exceptions. But Gapone had convinced Kropyvitsky that he was creating a loyal workers' organization, and he was given permission to do that. It took him a little while to realize that it was fraudulent, that he had a public message that the bishops heard about. Then there was a secret message that only his revolutionaries heard about. Again, that's nothing. You'll never find this in any English language history. And eventually, Kropyvitsky found this out, and that's when he was finally thrown out of the church. And then he went into exile. Afterwards, they eventually killed him. The left did. So, because they were never quite sure what he was. But the establishment histories will tell you that this procession had icons and the empire flags and everything else, and that was a ruse. They had broken into a church in Petersburg and stole the icons. So the whole thing was fraudulent. So while Gapone is telling everybody that this is a loyal, legitimate workers' organization, politics was never a problem. St. John of Kronstadt was a huge fan of the Black Hundreds, was even a member of the Black Hundreds, or the Union of the Russian People. But by this time, no one had supported the synodal system, or the College of Religious Confessions, whatever you want to call it. Because it did take, the church had no independence. It didn't have any financial independence. Every penny that came into the church had to go to the state. So, and of course, clergy and bishops were put on a state salary, which was nothing compared to what they were able to bring in otherwise. So, the state was no supporter of the church at this point. It did a lot of damage to it. And so when Nicholas II was overthrown, there was only 2 or 3 major bishops that were defending him.
And so Father Gapone then, you also talked about some of the foreign funding that this movement was getting. So, and I realize too that the definition of a patriot is, one that loves his country but may or may not necessarily love his government. But do you think that Father Gapone was a patriot, or do you think that he was a traitor?
Well, he certainly was no patriot, but he convinced a lot of people that he was one. And so again, like I said, he spoke out of both sides of his mouth. He was going to the left and saying that I'm one of you, don't worry about it, I'll bring the state along with me. Mm-hmm. And then going to his superiors and saying, no, I'm on your side, I'm going to bring the workers' movement into a pro-government direction. There's simply no reason to oppose the state at the time. The Russian economy was exploding. It was doing extremely well. Now it's true that the lies about the Russo-Japanese War were a huge problem because they weren't telling the truth about it. They needed to humiliate the Tsar by claiming it was this huge loss. And I've been in great detail about how that's certainly not the case. So he certainly was and he was spreading those rumors too, though I don't know how many ordinary Russians knew this, because I don't think there were any major newspapers in the empire at the time that were telling the truth about this. In fact, the Japanese commander of the siege of Port Arthur killed himself because of his defeat there, or I should say his Pyrrhic victory there. But the so-called Gapone Society which became a part of the so-called police socialism, or Zubatoshina, which was named after S.V. Zubatov, who was the head of the Moscow Security Department. And it was called the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers. And that was the organization that George Gapon ran. And early on, of course, he was a good man. He enjoyed great respect among the poor, very much like John of Kronstadt had done. And he said that the monarchy did not at all contradict the demands of the workers, but they still had to organize to improve their situation, especially with firms that were foreign owned. And the society was very successful at this. And he had the full support of the state at the time. And this means that the later violence in 1905 was completely senseless. Because not only was the economy doing very well, not only did Japan not defeat the Russian Empire, even if they did, the Russians, were maybe at 5% mobilization, where, of course, Japan was at 100% mobilization. They were right in their own backyard. But it didn't take long. When the Pulitov munitions factory went on strike, several members of the Gapon Society were dismissed because they were a part of it. And one of the people who helped kind of sway him was a Jew by the name of Pinchas Rutenberg, who worked as an engineer at the Pulitov factory. And he was the man who actually wrote the esoteric set of demands that occurred at the march on the Winter Palace. Now, Rutenberg was a Jewish nationalist. He loathed the Russian monarchy. He founded the American Jewish Congress, by the way. He was one of the founders of the American Jewish Congress. And he founded the Jewish Legion. And then later he controlled much of the Soviet electrical grid, and then founded the Palestine Electric Company, which is today the Electric Corporation of Israel. And he was one of the first leaders of the Jewish militia in Palestine, and he even founded Palestine Airways. Later he served as president of the Jewish National Council. Then he served under the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky. He was briefly imprisoned by the Reds, but then he was let go once they realized who he was. So this was the man who kind of turned, slowly but surely turned Gapon. And again, it was completely senseless because, things have been going very well there. No country ever was industrializing, without problems. Although Russian wages, given the cost of living, were the highest in Europe, they also had the lowest taxes anywhere.
Well, those two things combined should be a very big formula for prosperity.
You would, yeah, and this is why it was such a problem, and this is why they needed two wars to make it work. And the press lied about both. They lied about the Russo-Japanese War, then they lied about World War I. All the victories of the Russian front were not mentioned, but the setbacks were. The early supply issues, which every power in World War I suffered from, was talked about all the time as if no other power had it. It was strictly a Russian thing. But once it was solved after the first year, all of a sudden they stopped talking about it anymore. So the press then and now, I'm talking about now in America, was one of the main forces. And of course, Nicholas could have clamped down on them, but then after Bloody Sunday, he signed the Constitution. When he was visiting Queen Victoria years earlier, Queen Victoria had condemned the Russian press because they were saying they had a lot of anti-British statements. And Victoria says, well, why don't you clamp down on them? And Nicholas said that I'm not going to do that. We're not going to have media dictatorship in this country. Well, unfortunately, that was before all this, but that was really his death knell. And there were members of his bureaucracy that were not exactly rightist too. He couldn't control everything. He was surrounded by traitors. He knew this. My book on the murder of the royal family is called essentially, I forget the exact quote, deceitful cowards and traitors, and he was surrounded by them. All great leaders had this problem because they made a lot of enemies very quickly. So this was this was a disaster. This was and none of this had to happen. So they needed to exaggerate these wars for the sake of creating a sense of chaos in the country that eventually would create enough agitation to overthrow the system.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate.
If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
So, Father Capone, then, do you think that he really was the leader of the movement, or do you think that he was just the face of it and that there were far more sinister characters who were really calling the shots?
Well, I can't answer that directly. He was one leader. The left had trouble trusting him because he did receive money from the head of state security in St. Petersburg. Now, in January 6th of 2005, Gapon took part in a meeting with representatives of all the revolutionary parties, and the whole concept was the possibility of joint action between the striking workers of the Pulitov factory and the revolutionaries as he was putting this march together. And as I said, there was an exoteric list of demands that everyone thought they were going to the palace for, and then there was a completely separate set of demands. And it didn't come out until 1922, but Gapon wrote this, one of the things that were only given to the revolutionaries in the crowd. And he said, freedom is bought with blood. Freedom is won with guns in our hands in fierce battles. Don't ask the king anything. Don't demand from him anything. We do not humiliate ourselves before our sworn enemy. We'll throw him off the throne, down with autocracy, to arms, comrades. And that came from the Jurors Report in 1922, and it hadn't really come out by that point, but the overwhelming majority of the people who were marching had no idea that this existed. But there were a lot of parties, a lot of leftist parties in Russia at the time that never really amounted to much. The far left didn't really do well electorally, and they didn't have that many people. But because of all this, by January 7th, you had 105,000 people on strike. And so then the Petersburg Committee of the Socialist Revolutionaries decided to send its best agitators to all branches of the Assembly of Russian Factory Workers. And this is where essentially, and the Mensheviks were included here too. And Gapon said, if they beat us, you will answer the same. They'll be victims. We'll erect barricades, smash gun shops, break out prisoners, take over the phone and the telegraph. We'll make a revolution. So, but when the march started, he had to convince everybody on the outside that this was a peaceful, pro-royalist, pro-state institution. And for a long time it was. But he didn't tell everybody that he had this other agenda.
Well, you talk about the Japanese funding, you talk about some other, the British and so forth, a little bit, they came up. You're talking about how there was an agenda that was kind of a backseat or a hidden agenda in all this. And I'm going to guess that a lot of that was probably motivated by the people who were investing the money into it, these outside sources. Just break it down. Who were all of the outside influences and the outside sources of financing, and what was each of theirs particular interest in what was going on in Russia? I mean, why should the Japanese have cared? Why should the British have cared? Why should the Americans have cared? Just break it down for us.
I'm not sure the Americans cared one way or the other, but the bankers certainly cared, because being able to capture the Russian market would be the ultimate victory for these people, because the monarchy kept the bankers out and maintained control over the currency. You had 100 million people that were outside of American and Western capitalist hands, and that was a huge reason for this. As I said before, the growth of both Russia and Germany, Prussia before that, in terms of population, in terms of industrialization, in terms of just basic stability, up until this point. Under Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas's father, the revolutionary movement had been completely destroyed. They didn't have much to go on. How can you start a revolutionary movement when everyone's relatively happy at the time? But then the Russo-Japanese War came out, and everybody in the West began supplying Japan. The British supplied Japan with most of its navy, because all its navy was built in the shipyards of Northern Ireland, and with huge loans. which turned out to be grants. So, of course, the Japanese were at war with Russia, and of course, Germans later on in World War I. And so to overthrow their main enemy and the enemy of the West in general, you had this huge coalition of powers who were financing the revolutionary movement. One thing that Lenin said that always made me laugh is that, yeah, we'll take German money to overthrow the monarchy, and then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to overthrow the Germans. So these people really, I think they were kind of ignorant. I mean, no one really knew what a Bolshevik was at this period of time. I don't think many people in Congress today know what a Bolshevik is, let alone back then. That was a strange foreign word to most people. So, but even after World War I, the support of the white government and then the red government had a lot to do with keeping Germany from ever rising again. And all they knew was that the communists wanted a firm, centralized, militarized state. And that's one of the reasons they supported it, because it could keep Germany in check. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And so this was the ideology behind all of it. And remember, capitalism is a revolutionary force. It's never been a conservative force. Karl Marx made it clear in Capital. He made it clear even in the Manifesto to a lesser degree that capitalism is by definition international. Capitalism demands free trade. Free trade breaks down barriers between countries. It breaks down linguistic barriers. It breaks down regulatory barriers. It lowers wages. This is the only reason that Marx could be an internationalist, is because capitalism had laid down the groundwork for it. This is why capitalism had to come first before Marxism could even begin to function. So Karl Marx and everybody else on the left knew that capitalist free trade was absolutely essential for there to be any real international revolution. Well, Russia was the big monkey wrench into their system, because they did have substantial tariffs. They were trading substantially with Germany, and this was the left's great nightmare. Having those two as allies would mean that no one can move them. And so the only thing that was able to make that happen is the British maneuvering Germany into a war with Russia. And then, of course, the Russo-Japanese War before then. The wars were absolutely necessary to break the loyalty of certain classes of people to the monarchy. But even during World War I, the Russian economy grew. I believe the only economy in the entire war that actually grew during this period of time. Very little fighting took place on Russian soil. Gapon, really, by the time the march began, he had completely turned on the state. And one of the nasty things he did is that he spread the rumor. There were a lot of rumors that were spread in the crowd that the Tsar himself wanted to meet the people, and he even forged a statement. And the statement said this: said, "I, the Tsar, am powerless to cope with officials and elites. I want to help my people, but the nobles don't. Rise, Orthodox people, help me. Your king defeat our enemies." And the Bolshevik El Subotin said the point was to use the crown and loyalty of the people to start a revolution. And the authorities didn't even know about this other petition yet. But then when it was finally discovered, the order was given to arrest Gapon, but he had disappeared by that time. So, and Gapon very much knew he was preparing violence, and he had the elites of the world backing him up on it.
So what I'm trying to figure out in all of this is what, of course, the communists, the Soviets, they had their version of this, and their version was basically the official version, and it stood uncontested for however many years until you've, decided that it was time to challenge this. Tell me exactly what Soviet ends were served by the official story as the Soviets have told it in the historical record and in the schools and in the propaganda, for all these years. And if you need to actually kind of detail the Soviet version of the history, you can do that as well.
Well, the Soviet version, the Western version, the Menshevik version are all completely identical. And it's what I've already said, that this was a loyal, very friendly, very pro-monarchy procession to the palace. And by the way, the Tsar wasn't even there. And they were aware of this. And Gapon was aware of this. But he never told anybody this. But the interest was to make the Tsar look like a murderer. He had certainly nothing to do with the order to shoot. The shots first came from the crowd. They shot a few guards first before they finally returned fire. They did not want to. They shot over their heads a few times. So there were some of these marchers that were well armed and had hidden their weapons, and then at the proper time, they opened fire. So that's why anyone was killed at all. So that's the red version, of course, doesn't mention that, but no version mentions that. Now, this kind of thing today is all over Russia. Most Russians understand this today. But unless you could read the language, you have no idea what's going on. So that's why I had to write this article. And there's so many translations that have never seen the light of day that shows exactly what was going on here and what Gapon really was. But and no American historian is going to touch it.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America, and we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
For example, in the Barnes Review, there was an illustration of the Tsar's men, violently beating these protesters who were supposed to be friendly protesters that had, appeared in different publications at the time. And I noticed that it was an illustration and not a photograph, which probably tells me that the exact opposite happened and they had to manufacture the graphic evidence.
Yeah, Paul found some of those pictures, and the captions were written by me. And I'm very happy that Paul found that one. I had trouble finding it. The newspapers were running stories that had pictures like that in there, or, forged photographs, which, the technology existed, believe it or not, at the time. It was great, it was weak at the time, but they certainly had it. There was photography in the Civil War. But for the most part, newspapers used drawings. So they could do whatever they want with drawings. They were saying, 50,000 people were killed initially. I mean, they were making up all kinds of numbers. They were doing the same thing in World War I. They were doing the same thing in Russo-Japanese War. And again, no one's going to even talk about this. But it's important to note that this march had 300,000 people, and the closer this giant mass, and they came from more than one direction, more it got to the square, the more it became subjected to agitation with the provocateurs. But the left was spreading rumors. The rumors were deadly. And they were spreading rumors with this huge crowd that the monarchy was planning mass executions. Now, the march from the Narva outpost was led by Gapon himself, who used a slogan, "If we were refused, we no longer have a czar." But wherever the soldiers tried to halt the procession, it was so large that they simply couldn't do it. By then, I think security services were aware of what was really going on. And then even in Gapon's section, they knocked down telephone poles, they built barricades, and of course they broke into several gun shops. Because of course there was no, control over weapons in the empire either. The Shav weapons factory was right on their route, and the Bolshevik L.D. Davidov was one of the ones. He used 200 men to break in and take it. So the crowd was being agitated by these trained militants, and the police station was destroyed. There was an attempt to take the prison and the telegraph. So, but this is Alexei Lopukhine, who had some vague sympathy for the socialists. He wrote this in his report to the superiors. The Lopukhine reports came out in 1922. Crowds of people, not subject to the usual general police measures and even cavalry attacks, stubbornly sought access to the Winter Palace, and then, irritated by resistance, began to attack military units. The state of affairs led to the need for emergency measures to establish order, and military units had to act against these huge masses of men with firearms. So when that happened, Gapon began, he's constantly, he has printing presses, he took over the telegraph, and he was trying to convince the soldiers to, lay down their weapons. And he was actually claiming to be the spokesman for the church, and that anyone who shoots at us is going to be excommunicated. So this whole thing is based on rumors. And D.F. Tripov, they just recently created the St. Petersburg Governor General, was granted extraordinary powers. And he finally granted order in the city, and he knew what was happening, and Tripov had meetings with representatives of legitimate labor organizations. So he wasn't afraid to show firmness, and he knew that any display of weakness would cost many more victims than already occurred. So he was a militant monarchist, but he actually stopped the bloodshed, because the minute the crowd saw the state take firm action, he said that we managed to stop further street clashes in almost one day. So by January 11th, the troops had gone to the barracks. By January 17th, the Pulatov plant resumed operation. So they won. That's pretty much ended the revolution of 1905. And compared to the malice of Gapon, Nicholas's reaction was remarkable. And Nicholas only had limited information, but for the handful of people who were actually killed, Nicholas sent 50,000 rubles from his own personal funds for each victim, including those who were wounded. So 50,000 rubles is about 6 months' salary for everybody. Using rumors, pretending that this was loyal, 2 sets of demands, one public, one private. But this is how the left always operates. It's always a deceitful organization, no matter where they go.
After the dust had settled from this, Gapon leaves the country. He flees, but yet you write that in March of 1906, or maybe even a little bit before that, that Gapon came back to Russia, somewhat repentant and, trying to set the record straight and maybe undo some of the mess that he had created or that he was used to create.
Yeah, he did. He exposed. He had such knowledge of the revolutionary movement by that time. He came back March 28, 1906. The Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionaries Party had agreed to kill him. The very same Rutenberg was the guy who pulled the trigger. And of course, Rutenberg is one of these connections between Zionism and Marxism, because I'd already said this guy was one of the founders of Israel. He founded he founded the Jewish Congress all over the place. But Rutenberg was a little odd because he hated the monarchy due to his Jewish nationalism, not out of any necessarily, communist idea. Russia had been very good to him prior to the revolution. Jews in Russia led a very privileged life in relative luxury. So, yeah, he came back and they eventually killed him because they knew that he didn't seem to have any stable loyalties. He went back and forth so many times. Given the information that he had learned by that point, they knew he couldn't be trusted. So they killed him.
So do you think that he went back and forth over and over again because he was trying to see who would give him the best deal or who would give him the most funding or who would give him the most support? Or do you think he went back and forth because he could see the duplicitousness in all of the other factions and all of the other leaders and all of the other potential supporters or detractors, And do you think he went back and forth because he just didn't know who he could trust?
Well, those aren't all mutually exclusive ideas. I think they're all true. And that's why he's in such a bad situation. For him to come back generally bespeaks a great degree of repentance, because he knew that if he gets captured, that would be the end of him. He put a few revolutionaries in prison with his testimony. So the very fact that he came back, knowing full well that that might be the end of him, suggests legitimate repentance. But prior to that, his actions during the march itself suggested that he had completely broken with the church. He was gone. He was defrocked by that time anyway. Kropotkin kept trying to summon him, and he refused all orders to return to Kiev, and so then he was kicked out at that point. So I'm just saying, I don't know this for a fact, but trying to get back into good graces with the church may also be part of his motive. But given everything you said there, those aren't mutually exclusive. They're all true.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
So what was the motivation then for the official version of the story? What did the Soviets have to gain by, propagating the version of the story that they propagated, and what did they have to lose had the truth come out?
Well, I answered that already. It's that they needed to paint the Tsar in the worst possible colors, and killing loyal protesters for no good reason is probably the best possible thing that they could have come up with. And then they could say from that, well, that radicalized previously loyal labor movements, and that coalesced into the Bolshevik Revolution. Therefore, the Bolshevik Revolution was a popular one, not a foreign-funded conspiracy. That's what was in it for them. And of course, the whites under the provisional government too said the same thing. And those are the people who really influenced historians in the West. Historians in the West a bit later were using Russian newspapers that were promoting propaganda, and British newspapers as well, as their sources for what was going on. And it took many, many years, really only in exile, for the Russian monarchists to finally tell the truth. But since they never spoke in English, it never took. And so even today we have this problem that no one really knows what's going on. Specialists in Russian history have a tendency to be pretty useless people, because they're still going by the same bad sources that their fathers and grandfathers had supported. And they have no excuse, because they usually can read Russian, and so they probably know the facts, but wouldn't dare say them. There's a reason I'm not in academia anymore. But the fact that so many Jews were involved, and it was just, in this case, to sum it all up, it was nothing more than a leftist hijacking of legitimate grievances. With a huge portion of the army sent to the Japanese War, it was very easy for some of these people to agitate. So it really, and of course exaggerating the failures of the army both in Japan and in World War I is again one of the reasons that they drove people away. And of course all newspapers were saying that the Tsar just killed these people for no reason, even though he wasn't even there, and gave no orders one way or the other, and never reported that the Tsar was giving compensation to these people, although he knew eventually that it wasn't their fault either.
So the Americans, the British, and other Western powers never claimed to be, friends of the Soviets or the communists, and at least officially, claimed to be non-Marxist nations. And so what benefit did they have in basically perpetuating the Soviet propaganda? Why didn't they just come out and at least, tell the truth in their own publications and in their own schools and in their own version of the history?
Because they were never anti-communist. They opposed the idea of a Russian empire, no matter what was running it. But as far as Marxism as such, there was never any opposition to it. They were trading in the most sensitive areas from 1920 to right up to the late 80s. No sanctions were ever put on the Russian Empire. They were making a fortune trading. They were building plants in Russia during the Great Depression. GE laid out their electrical grid. Henry Ford built the biggest Ford plant in the world in eastern Ukraine in 1936. So much for Ford's anti-communism. He was there to make money. The mining company from Alaska built their gold mining operations. The Rockefellers eventually created Amoco, the American oil company, took over the Soviet oil production. And the Rothschilds were, floating them loans. And early on, Woodrow Wilson was sending them food aid. Whenever their economy was about to collapse, the West would come in and save them over and over and over again. So these people weren't, the only fear that they ever had was that, the Russo-Chinese empire would then not need the dollar anymore. But they solved that problem. But that had nothing to do with Marxism. Simply the empire was becoming too big. Any empire that big would have been a threat to the U.S. It had nothing to do with ideology.
So then, tell me, are there any similarities between what's going on in Russia at that time? Obviously there were forces within the country who were trying to stir up revolt and rebellion and, stir up the masses and stir up protest and so forth. And we're seeing the same things happen here in the United States today. Is there any similarity?
Well, I gave a brief answer to that already. I think the foreign funding is a big similarity. The press manipulation is another. The dissimilarities are the fact that there's no major war. The internet makes it possible to gain alternative sources of information. The patriots tend now to outnumber the leftist forces today. Without funding from the banks and without media cover, I don't think these organizations could function. As you well know, Black Lives Matter is run by Jews. Miss Rosenberg, who was part of the violence in the 1960s, is one of the major leaders of Black Lives Matter. There's a few others, I can't think of their names off the top of my head, taking what blacks think are, or some blacks anyway, think are legitimate grievances, which they're not, and then using that for their own purposes. Again, that's something that's similar too. But rather than the police showing firmness and thereby ending this once and for all, they're doing just the opposite. And in fact, are demonizing anybody who tries to defend themselves. So you may have heard by now, the St. Louis couple now has felony charges laid against them. Now the governor of Missouri has said that he's going to, if they're convicted, which they can't be, it's just a message sent to them, sent to everybody who wants to defend themselves. I don't think they can be convicted, but even if they are, the governor's going to immediately pardon them. But traitors are everywhere. I mean, the state in the U.S. is a huge backer of Black Lives Matter, despite the fact, and despite Trump, who can barely rule on his own today, and he's subject to the same cowards that Tsar Nicholas was. So there's definitely similarities, but it's certainly not identical.
Well, you had mentioned, and we might have been off air when you had said this, that Black Lives Matter was getting billions of dollars from Bank of America and from other major banks. And given who you've said is running Black Lives Matter, is this just basically the bankers taking money out of their right pocket and putting it into their own left pocket? Or, who is this money actually going to?
Well, I have no reason to think that it's not going to anything other than the groups that they're intended to get it. A lot of people are getting wealthy off these movements. There's this rise, I don't know if you read a few articles, the so-called rise of anti-Semitism among black leaders. That's going to be a huge challenge for the bankers. And if they ever cut them off, that's going to be the reason. But I think the people who control them are going to be able to put the lid on this. I'm not sure if people like, Kanye West are able to really sway the masses. Now, I don't know if you've noticed either that most of these pictures, they're mostly white people at these demonstrations, especially in white areas. Black Lives Matter has become really a white and Jewish movement, with a few exceptions. Now, initially, after the Floyd's overdose in Minneapolis, it was black, but that ended very, very quickly, and it was then hijacked and taken over by Jewish and white elements. And of course, Antifa and Black Lives Matter have fought it out in the streets too, because the minute Black Lives Matter starts becoming black nationalist and quoting Farrakhan and people like that, and all of a sudden, Antifa is now at war with them. They've duked it out in a few places already, which is fine by me. That's something that you're not going to get out of the press. So I have no reason to believe this money isn't going to them. But just like Bloody Sunday, it's a hijacking of a movement that would have petered out by now.
So, Bloody Sunday, 1905. Do you think that, of course, the official story here is that it was one of a chain event of things that culminated in, the people rising up in 1917 and overthrowing the empire and, forming the glorious Soviet whatnot. Is there any truth to that, or was this something that happened, it ended, and didn't have any subsequent influence on, in other words, the subsequent history, or the subsequent things we now know as the history, would have taken place, the Soviets would have come to power, blah, 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 whether the Bloody Sunday of 1905 happened or not, or was this really the matchlight and the catalyst and the spark that began the flame?
Without foreign funding and without the war, the left would have been just a handful of cranks at this point, because the economy had done very, very well from, throughout the late 19th century all the way up until the end of World War I. The peasantry owned the land. You had the lowest taxes. You had the lowest cost of living and therefore the highest wages. You had a monarchy that had very little to do with the day-to-day actions of local government. You had the peasant commune, which still existed despite having been injured by people like Witte and others. And so, the press, I like everything else, I'm willing to blame the press for most of this. Yeah, the money is a huge element. But if the press wasn't covering for them, and if the press was telling the truth, I'm not so sure any of this could have happened. And the Germans were really stupid to be sending money to this group of people who they knew were preaching global revolution. And as you know, one of the things that brought Hitler to power later was the takeover of Bavaria. And it became the Bavarian People's Republic, which was 100% Jewish. Same thing for the Hungarian People's Republic. These were 100% Jewish at the government level. So the Germans were idiotic to use these people to overthrow the Tsar, because they were well aware of what their agenda really was. But as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, Bloody Sunday is a huge part of their mythology, because they saw whether this radicalized the population, and therefore it was a popular movement from there on in. That was never the case. So
I'm going to ask you the same question in regard to what's going on now, Black Lives Matter and some of this other stuff that we're seeing now. Is this going to be a Roman candle of sorts, and it's going to make a big splash, and it's going to make a big scene, and it's going to look like a lot, but once it fizzles out, it's not going to have had a whole lot of impact on the ongoing history of the nation and the world? Or do you think that this is the beginning, and we're about to see far worse and radical change and major revolution on the horizon? And I always enjoy having my good friend Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson as my guest here on TBR Radio. It's always a joy to talk to him, and he's just such a insightful person. May very well be our nation's foremost expert on all things Russian. And so whenever we can have him on the program, it's just always a good thing, because there just aren't very many people who could speak, as he said earlier in the broadcast, who could speak intelligently on Russian history. And so these things have always been intriguing and interesting to me, and I hope that they are to you, our listeners, as well. I'd like to encourage you to go to Dr. Johnson's website, www.russjournal.org. That's www.rusjournal.org. And you can see all of Dr. Johnson's articles and essays and blogs and academic papers there on that website. I'd also like to encourage you to go to www.barnesreview.org. www.barnesreview.org. You can find out all about the Barnes Review and about TBR Radio. And you can find out how you could subscribe to what is probably the world's foremost revisionist history publication, which is TBR Magazine or the Barnes Review Magazine. But we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio presents the TBR History Hour. But we will be back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. I will see you then. Until then, God bless.